In the fruitless and revolting world of internet leftism, stating simply that we as communists should reject American values and understand the USA and its ideals as settler colonial things which have no place in the construction of communism and thus represent something to be fought against tooth and nail, seems to bring crawling out of even the most self-professed experts of Marxism the rabid specter of bourgeois nationalism. Drop a death to America anywhere, and you'll have supposed revolutionaries instantly clamoring in the responses to tear you down for suggesting their precious motherland has no place in a communist future. You'll be accused of anti-Marxist, anti-dialectical, anti-proletarian behavior, sectarianism, idealism, and a complete disconnect from the practical tasks at hand for communists worldwide, especially here in the belly of the beast. But where does this come from? To the patriotic socialist, which even includes many a person who thinks themselves separate from the lunacy of MAGA communism, a call to purge nationalist myth from our ranks for the better of the revolutionary movement is a sacrilege, pushing them into a reactionary fervor to protect their personal feelings towards a nation which, in all reality, wants them dead. Oftentimes, as is so common on the internet, the argument begins from an elevated platform, framing themselves as an experienced, committed communist with thousands of hours in practical and theoretical work. They'll criticize you for trying to push a message which the American proletariat will never be receptive to, naively shouting sectarianism. They'll shake their head and tut at you, wringing their hands with the jaded knowledge that we must cater to and coddle American workers, not hurting their feelings or ever having them come to terms with their complicity with and indoctrination by a genocidal empire, if we are ever to build a strong movement. At best, the patriotic socialists are a new strain of country ball losers who simply view history as a paradox game, and at worst, they believe themselves to actually be well-versed in communist theory and practice, with real, valued proclamations for the task of the revolutionary movement here. In the end, however, they are all united in a romanticized view of history, unable to view historical processes as such, and completely afraid of the materialist understanding, as well as a frankly non-Marxist ideology which manifests itself in American left exceptionalism, and a false conception of the relations between party, class, and the practical goals and necessary actions of the communist movement. Here, we will not be covering the historical development of this eclectic distortion of Marxism so much as its flaws, to be used as a vehicle to discuss the present movement and its necessary direction. What is American left exceptionalism, or left exceptionalism? What is class defeatism, one of its symptoms? Here, we'll define American left exceptionalism as a variant of American exceptionalism which appears in many supposedly left-wing circles, expressed as a flawed understanding of America that presents the country's material reality as unique from the rest of the world, consciously or unconsciously taking normal exceptionalism at face value while claiming to reject it. This can express itself as historical mythologization, which we will discuss more in a moment, but more important are its ramifications in the field of practical action and discussion on the communist movement in the USA and how to achieve its goals. Another form of this, which we won't really cover here, but which informs some of the following content, is that in understanding America as the number one capitalist imperialist power, many go beyond the materialist understanding and imagine it to be a totally unique evil, believing revolution to be impossible here as a result, which has been disproven in part most recently by the heroic Palestinian resistance showing that it is possible to defeat a most technologically advanced and powerful enemy, or by creating an exception by considering it as that unique evil which removes it from the context of the rest of the world capitalist imperialist system and its historical development. Let's begin with a proper situation of the Marxist understanding of the USA. Understanding America means understanding that it is a nation like any other, subject to the very same rules and laws as the whole world. This means understanding it as it is materially. It is a settler colonial nation, built on the genocide and subjugation of the indigenous population. It is a state built also on the back of African slavery, a ruthlessly imperialist state, and a wholly capitalist state. These four qualities are the ideals and values of the founding American Revolution, a revolution entirely bourgeois democratic in its aims, interests, and benefits. They are also the guiding pillars which American society is built on, and to this day, the American political system and state exists to ensure the maintenance of these relations. Despite whatever reform has occurred, this nation exists to consolidate in the ruling class and to a differing extent to its settler population the victories of indigenous genocide and expulsion, never allowing them to overturn the dynamic or regain meaningful power, of African slavery, never allowing them concrete restitution for their labor or power in society as well, of imperialism, never allowing for the cessation of imperial control, expansion, and genocide abroad, and of exploitation, never relinquishing the dictatorship of capital and the subservience of the American working class. The American system is not unique. There are plenty of parallels with other bourgeois democracies in their methods of maintaining the capitalist system, such as its predecessor in the seat of imperial domination and one of the originators of said system, Britain, or any number of other colonial powers, as well as parallels with other settler colonies and nations built on slavery in their methods of maintaining the settler-colonial and slave relation. Think of Canada, Australia, Israel, Algeria, any settler colonial state, and you'll see a similar settler mythology and practical system of enforcing the settler-colonial relation. I'd recommend reading The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon for a better orientation on these things. And if you want a bit more on America specifically, linked below is a short article which has a lot of overlaps with this piece. Here we'll use two main examples: the Communist Party of the United States of America, or CPUSA, and the American Communist Party, or ACP, in order to illustrate how left exceptionalism infects practical questions ranging from the CPUSA's class defeatism, which is a lack of faith in the proletariat's historical role in communist revolution and their revolutionary energy, to the truly deranged and open chauvinism of the ACP. We'll do this largely by examining them at what should be their best via official party programs and documents, especially to avoid getting bogged down shooting fish in a barrel with the truly buck-wild takes that abound in the ACP's odd corner of the internet. Clearly, neither of these organizations hold anything close to a leading role in the revolutionary movement here, but they do stand as good examples of the more and less extreme insistence on inserting American values into communist politics that can be found endemic to the so-called American left. We'll begin with our more serious critique of the lesser forms of American nationalist ideals that tend to permeate a larger swath of the left here. Oftentimes, patriotic socialists are able to understand parts of material reality and are able to call out American imperialism and the exploitation of the American bourgeoisie, but it's frequently in their vision for revolution in the United States where the nationalism comes leaking out, taking the abortive image of a socialist America. In the CPUSA, and even to a certain extent the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or PSL, in their Meet the Proletariat Where They Are approach, we can see a tempered left exceptionalism, which manifests itself as class defeatism and straddles the line between conscious chauvinism and unconscious, lazy pseudo-Marxism. Most of this is limited to sloganeering, however, and an insistence on using rhetoric and terms familiar and inoffensive to American establishment sensibilities. In truth, this is little more than chauvinism disguised as tactics, stemming from, at worst, an intention to neuter the workers' movement, which wouldn't be too surprising given the CPUSA's history since COINTELPRO, or at best either unchecked nationalist sentiments or ideological laziness, aka not actually committing yourself to the study of Marxism. After taking a look at some of their materials, we'll delve into an attempt to elucidate the proper revolutionary position in the United States, situated in an actually Marxist reading of revolutionary theory and practice. Let's start at the CPUSA party program. In a section titled Reform and Revolution, they write that we need radical solutions, expanded democracy, and broad unity. We, the working class and our allies, need to take power from the hands of the wealthy few, their corporations, and their political operatives. We need peace, justice, and equality. We need socialism. How they intend to go about making that radical change we shall see in a moment, but they go on to describe their view of communist society, saying that communism will be a society without exploitation, without social classes, without war, without constant attacks on our shared environment, and without any coercive apparatus, and with only such administration required to meet people's needs, create the conditions for full democratic freedom, and for the humane development of society and the individual for human happiness. None of this is too egregious yet, but one should start to see where much of their rhetoric is being couched in and curbed by an insistence on appealing to American values. Socialism is not a thing to be won by working class conquest, but by expanded democracy and broad unity. Not a thing that'll work to fundamentally uproot and abolish the capitalist relation and all of its vestiges, but something that will finally achieve the unfinished goals of the American Revolution. Now, they come right out and say this in an article from 2016, putting socialism as literally equal to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we'll see more of this rhetoric in a moment. A common thing amongst unserious communists, people who refuse to do the tough work of imagining a better world in a pragmatic, scientific manner, is an incredibly limp and uninspiring vision of a communist future. The best they can muster are platitudes about equity and real democracy. These are clear indications of thinking that has not actually moved past accepting bourgeois propositions about the importance of individual liberty, freedom, and democracy, and truly represent dead ends for the revolutionary energy of the working class. From their section on the working class and the trade union movement, many of the key needs of working people cannot be won by the trade union movement or the working class alone. There are other major social forces whose interests substantially parallel those of the working class. Unions must engage in coalitions with community, civil rights, women's, student, seniors, and other organizations to increase their combined ability to win against a powerful enemy. From strike struggles to legislative initiatives to fight for the White House, labor must build unity with these forces to achieve progress. So, class collaboration is the word of the day. Socialists should fight for a seat in the White House, not tear it down. And no, Marx, the proletariat actually aren't the leaders of the revolution. This is heavily influenced by the CPUSA's own reformist goals and interpretation of the American situation. In The Democratic Struggle, they correctly identify that the characterization of the US as the most democratic country on earth is propaganda, but then instantly turn around and write that a workers' democracy is more expansive, meaningful, and inclusive than democracy under capitalism, which may certainly be true, but to them, democracy is about democratic rights, civil liberties, and free and fair elections. It is about the right to protest, demonstrate, and work for change. It is concerned with protecting an independent media and access to an internet free of political censorship. A workers' democracy also means having democratic input and control of the economy and being free from corporate power and domination at work, in the community, and in government. The struggles of all class and social forces who seek to curb the power of the transnationals are democratic struggles. The aim of working class struggle is to subordinate capital to the will of labor. In the long term, this means winning power to construct socialism. This comes amid plenty more fluff about how the workers' struggle is a democratic struggle, as their only care is to assure the sensibilities of the indoctrinated American that they'll restrict themselves to the tracks laid down by our callous overlords. How offensive it is to be confronted by self-proclaimed communists whose wildest dreams, whose victorious society simply consists of capital being subordinated to labor, rather than strangling capital with the goal of eradicating it from this world, who shrink away from the reality of the task at hand, which necessitates the destruction of all these bogus notions laid out by bourgeois democracy, such as a slavish insistence on freedom from political censorship, whatever that means. The point is, the CPUSA's completely harebrained reformist program, we'll see more of this in a moment, which stems from a total misunderstanding of American conditions, is the logical conclusion of their obsession with terms like democracy and liberty, resulting from the unquestioning acceptance of American ruling class rhetoric. When we look to Lenin later, we will see that there can be proper communist use of these terms, and we do not reject them on a rigid, absolutist basis. Rather, we reject their use as simple-minded slogans at the same level our rulers use them. In any case, they continue. Third parties which recognize the need for left-center unity to defeat the extreme right play an important and positive role towards shifting the balance of forces and moving closer to the formation of a viable anti-monopoly third party. The Communist Party's approach to people's electoral politics reflects our view that the current stage of struggle requires an all-people's front to defeat the extreme right, and requires within that front a strong and growing labor movement, left, and Communist Party. Here's the flawed position we've been talking about. Before the reader can even catch their breath to give them the benefit of the doubt, they come out and declare that this is an essential strategy for this historical period, not just a temporary tactic. The struggle to defend an enlarged democracy in every realm of life is therefore the only path to socialism in our country. Any other path will fail and is politically indefensible. As Lenin said, all democracy consists in the proclamation and realization of rights which under capitalism are realizable only to a very small degree and only relatively. But without the proclamation of these rights, without a struggle to introduce them now, immediately, without training the masses in the spirit of this struggle, socialism is impossible. The pain. Please don't quote Lenin to justify your banal social democracy. If you think this is an unfair characterization, they tell us straight up that the Communist Party aims for a peaceful transition to socialism, based on all forms of mass democratic expression and social action, electoral and non-electoral, to win and maintain working people's power. Good God. And that our party, with deep roots in U.S. history and culture, with its long-standing principled fight for working-class unity, for civil rights and full equality for all, for genuine reforms, for maintaining and extending constitutional rights, is an indispensable component of the coalition needed to win socialism. Is this not the height of bourgeois nationalism? Of course, we don't stand for violence or anything that would meaningfully oppose the fanatical, genocidal capitalism of the United States. Never. In fact, we actually stand for all the same things that you, good bourgeois, can claim allegiance to, and are one and the same with you and your legacy of false promises. As a part of American historical romanticization, which we'll see in its much greater delusion with the ACP, the New Deal is consistently looked upon as a high point in the American worker struggle, rather than the neutering force it represented, and in their discussion of socialism in the USA, they delve deeper into total capitulation to American fantasy. Socialism in the United States will have distinctive characteristics because it will emerge from our unique political culture. From before the start of the American Revolution up to today, workers and their allies have struggled to create and extend democracy. A socialist Bill of Rights enshrined in amendments to the U.S. Constitution will guarantee all the freedoms we have won over centuries of struggle. It will include extended rights fundamental to socialism, the rights to justice, liberty, and equality. Our vision is of a humane, socialist USA, which can be achieved in part by enshrining more freedom and democracy in a socialist Bill of Rights. Whew. This is what we mean by the abortive notion of a socialist America. Without being a total broken record, when you limit yourself to the parameters laid out by the bourgeoisie, the result will always be a complete capitulation to capitalism. And the American petty bourgeois, don't you worry, because under socialism, key industries will be nationalized, but there will be other forms of socialist ownership. Private ownership of small businesses will stick around under socialism, and of course, every individual will privately own their personal possessions and personal property. We all know how easily the American has been deluded into the mind-numbing claim that communists want you to share your toothbrush, but such a callous assurance that private property will so simply remain is such a pitiful demonstration of how far they've sunk into bourgeois mania. Let's end with their view of the role of the Communist Party. The Communist Party needs to be a party that is simultaneously internationalist and a defender of the interests of our own country's working class, and that is completely independent of the interests and ideology of capitalism. How they achieve this independence, you'll just have to take their word on, with how easily one could mistake this program for that of a capitalist party. Not to mention the damn near reactionary dog whistle which seems to contrast the interests of our own country's working class to the international working class. These interests, in reality, are one and the same if you're principled communists as they claim to be. We call the CPUSA class defeatists because their idea of the tactics required to mobilize the proletariat here consists of, according to the most charitable take, coddling the working class through sloganeering that utilizes American nationalist rhetoric so as to translate socialism into American terms. In reality, this distorts the aims of communists into an incredibly limited, twisted form, and really comes from a class defeatist position which views the American proletariat as unique, more deserving than non-Americans of careful, inoffensive politics because they're not ready for the scary, true aims of the communists, which necessitate the violent conquest of power and abolition of the capitalist system. To them, the American proletariat will never accept these vital proclamations, and so we need to make things sound nicer to their ears, rather than push them towards true, unabashed, unequivocal class consciousness. To them, the American proletariat does not operate on the same rules of any other proletariat and is uniquely deserving of kindness because somehow they both understand democracy better than anyone else due to the uniquely awesome American political system, and simultaneously require coddling so as to not have them meaningfully deal with their position in the imperial core. This amounts to lying to the proletariat and not practical political maneuvering and a pragmatic communist program. This is at best concealing our aims, which is not inherently bad, but it runs counter to productive action because it hampers the role of the communist vanguard, of the Communist Party, which is to enforce and build an independent class position. To class defeatists, there's no hope in a truly revolutionary position being taken up by the proletariat. We have to meet them where they are without raising any alarms in bourgeois sensibility, rather than illuminating the only path forward which will truly liberate them, which is the uncompromising abolition of the present state of things. And this is being rather kind and assuming the best of intentions in our proclaimed comrades, when what is usually occurring is a refusal to critique their own beliefs, projecting onto the proletariat their own discomfort with having to reckon with the difficult tasks at hand, which require calling into question and purging all bourgeois ideology from our ranks. In most cases, what has been discussed prior largely stems from a shallow understanding of Marxism, reminiscent of the Kotskys and Lassalle's, which attempts to drape itself in communist aesthetics without doing the actual work of constructing a consistent framework,
which leaves no room for bourgeois nations and ideals,
and putting forth the actual revolutionary positions and doing the actually revolutionary work of putting yourself on the line for the conquest of power and establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, let's discuss the actual role of the Communist Party here and dispel some misunderstandings about this. In order to do this, we'll be lifting heavily from Lenin and his two tactics of social democracy and the democratic revolution. This work can easily be read uncritically in parts, and misquoted, similar to the CPUSA's earlier bastardization from another of his works, to be in support of electoral politics in principle and reformist pacifism. A major fact that is vital to understand in the fight ahead of us is that America has already gone through its bourgeois revolution. But why is this important? Don't many people understand this? The point is rather that, in simply reading Lenin's tactical prescriptions, not considering the context they were written in, one can easily become confused and elevate aspects of the Bolsheviks' practical program in light of the 1905 Russian Revolution to the level of organizational principle. What we should rather take from this document is the fight against reformist distortions, and that we must center in our minds that the fundamental prescription is to focus on an unadulterated effort to push forward working-class action, that the only correct course of action is that which pushes the proletariat into its leading role and towards the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin writes that Marxism teaches the proletarian not to keep aloof from the bourgeois revolution, not to be indifferent to it, not to allow the leadership of the revolution to be assumed by the bourgeoisie, but, on the contrary, to take a most energetic part in it, to fight most resolutely for consistent proletarian democratism, for the revolution to be carried to its conclusion. We cannot get out of the bourgeois democratic boundaries of the Russian Revolution, but we can vastly extend these boundaries, and within these boundaries we can and must fight for the interests of the proletariat, for its immediate needs, and for conditions that will make it possible to prepare its forces for the future complete victory. Now, one can easily, and lazily, read this as him advocating for blind, often presented as principled participation in bourgeois democracy, but he continues, there are bourgeois democratic regimes like the one in Germany, and also the one in England, like the one in Austria, and also like those in America and Switzerland. He would be a fine Marxist indeed, who in a period of democratic revolution failed to see the difference between the degrees of democratism and the difference between its forms, and confined himself to clever remarks to the effect that, after all, this is a bourgeois revolution, the fruit of bourgeois revolution. Yes, Lenin is advocating that communists should participate in progressive struggles wherever they are, and to not callously shrug off things as bourgeois, but the call to action here is to assure proletarian leadership of these struggles, for them to be turned to benefit proletarian interests to the extreme wherever possible. And once again, even by that time, but really since 1776, we could understand America as a bourgeois democracy, and thus the more immediate tactical prescription here is kind of moot, We are in the age of proletarian revolution. There is no bourgeois revolution to push further. We don't have to worry about any of this collaboration with the bourgeoisie. Lenin elucidates this point with his usual expertise. Concrete political aims must be set in concrete circumstances. All things are relative, all things flow, and all things change. German social democracy does not put into its program the demand for a republic. The situation in Germany is such that this question can in practice hardly be separated from that of socialism, although with regard to Germany too, Engels in his comments on the draft of the Erfurt program in 1891 warned against belittling the importance of a republic and of the struggle for a republic. In Russian social democracy, the question of eliminating the demand for a republic from its program and its agitation has never even arisen, for in our country there can be no talk of an indissoluble link between the question of a republic and that of socialism. It was quite natural for a German social democrat of 1898 not to place special emphasis on the question of a republic, and this evokes neither surprise nor condemnation. But in 1848, a German social democrat who would have relegated to the background the question of a republic would have been a downright traitor to the revolution. There is no such thing as abstract truth. Truth is always concrete. To break this down a little more, Lenin explains a bit before this how different moments in the workers' movement change our necessary tactics. A revolutionary period differs from ordinary, everyday, preparatory periods in history in that the temper, excitement, and convictions of the masses must and do express themselves in action. While it is true that in America we are not in a revolutionary period, rather a preparatory period, the tactical necessities of the hour are certainly not to unthinkingly participate in bourgeois democracy, certainly not to kowtow to the desires of bourgeois leaders who are firmly and unflinchingly in control of the tools of power. Rather, what we need to be doing in this preparatory period is solidifying the independent class position of the proletariat and its interests. As Lenin writes, to exert every effort to instill a party spirit into the proletariat, to weld its vanguard into a genuine political party, absolutely independent of all other parties, and absolutely its own master. It is therefore incumbent upon us to exercise extreme caution in taking any step likely to cause confusion in clear-cut and definite party relations. The entire liberal bourgeoisie is now doing its very utmost to prevent the formation of a fully independent class party of the proletariat, in order to unite and merge the entire liberation movement in a single stream of democratism, with the purpose of concealing the bourgeois nature of that democratism. This directive, without uncritically raising it to the level of immortal principle as we accuse our enemies and perhaps well-meaning comrades of, is something we can lift as a timeless piece of guidance. Things are always in flux, as Lenin said, and tactics are always changing, but the goals of the communists stay the same, and it is necessary to keep in mind that there are certain standards and principles which are more universal, not because they sound nice, but because they have been shown through rigorous practice and reflection to be necessary for the fulfillment of the proletariat's historical task. For instance, the conquest of power and establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat is the necessary first concrete step towards the construction of socialism. More specific to this discussion, too, is that to achieve those concrete goals, we must maintain the proletariat's independent class position, the incisive revolutionary communist position, which, capitulating to bourgeois ideals and slogans, like the revisionists of Lenin's day capitulating to bourgeois nationalism in the face of World War I, only serves to neuter. Another document, the Lyon Theses, written for the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy and published in 1926, lays out a clear program of party tactics and party action, which should help to further explain these fundamental necessities of the Communist Party in a preparatory period. The party cannot and must not restrict its activity either to merely conserving the purity of theoretical principles and organizational structure, or to achieving immediate successes and a numerical popularity regardless of the cost. At all times and in all places, it must consolidate the following 3 points. A. The defense and clarification of the fundamental programmatic postulates, that is, the theoretical knowledge of the working class movement in relation to new events as they arise. B. The assurance of the continuity of the organizational unity and efficiency of the party, and its defense against contamination by extraneous influences opposed to the revolutionary interests of the proletariat. And C. the active participation in all the struggles of the working class, including those that arise out of partial and limited interests, in order to encourage their development. Emphasis, however, must constantly be placed on the factor of their links with the final revolutionary aims, and with the conquests of the class struggle presented as stepping stones on the way to the indispensable combat to come. This means denouncing the perils of abandoning ourselves to partial accomplishments as though they were points of arrival, and the danger of bartering these for the conditions of class activity and combativity of the proletariat, which are the autonomy and independence of its ideology and its organizations, most important of which is the party. We'll end this section with a succinct yet powerful line from Lenin. "I grant you everything except power," Tsarism declares. "Everything is illusory except power," the revolutionary people reply. Now, to move on to the American Communist Party. The ACP's exceptionalism manifests itself as a fervent denial of American material conditions and refusal to grapple with the settler colonial reality. Really, an epidemic of stick-your-head-in-the-sandism. This is the Marxism of childish caricature, of those who see history, politics, and material reality as a Marvel movie, a fight between forces of good and evil. In other words, the complete absence of any materialist analysis, a void where critical thinking goes to die. An abyss. This is all they have to offer to the workers. On one hand, we have the blind fetishization of American nationalist symbols, which is indicative or symptomatic of the other hand. In practice, their understanding of Marxism and its role in the USA is limited to what is essentially a vibes-based politics which contains all of the ideological and practical rigor of a limp noodle. Where their program goes beyond the bounds of what they copied from the CPUSA, it enters into the realm of total delusion, and their chauvinism for the USA manifests practically, or rather completely impractically, as a fantasy land. To these kinds of patriotic socialists, we should take the American myth at face value, and wrap ourselves in a blanket of ideology whose only consistency lies not in its scientific application, but in its dream-like inconsistency. To be more clear, beyond the fascist insanity that most of its members spout publicly, the ACP's official face makes it plain to see that they are guilty of a complete absence of understanding of the difference between proletarian and national culture, and somehow have even less of an idea than the CPUSA in regards to American material conditions and the task at hand, both of which result from a complete lack of rigorous Marxist politics, which have been substituted for the aforementioned Candyland they all seem to live in. As a side note, trying to access their website dropped a fucking nuke on my computer, kicking my browser's CPU usage from like 20% up to 700%. I'm not sure what the fuck they got going on there, but beware, I suppose. Like, maybe they're mining Bitcoin or something? In any case, let's begin with a section from their party constitution describing their view of the party and its role. The American Communist Party is the fighting organization of the American working class, and within the country, now governed by today's United States of America and Canada, it aspires to be the leading political force of the whole people. The party upholds and strives to deepen the American revolutionary tradition beginning in 1776, and for the construction of a sovereign and united republic of, by, and for the American people. Basing its outlook upon the historical synthesis of Marxism-Leninism, the party endeavors towards a new synthesis of Marxism within the American context in an age characterized by the breakdown of the unipolar world system and the emergence of a new mode of production. Sorry, but we will engage in some pointless bashing here. I guess they want Trump to annex Canada? This is truly indicative of their general political immaturity and silliness, as well as the complete lack of grounding in, well, reality. On top of that, we can see once again the fetishization of the American Revolution, that ugly revolt of slavers, the only thing they sought to overthrow being the British Empire's slight restrictions on how much they could genocide West and enslave Africans, and the disgusting aberration of a sovereign and united republic resting on the hollow platitude of, by, and for the American people, thoroughly devoid of any revolutionary intent or meaning. Another thing to note is this dumbfounding, utterly ahistorical, anti-Marxist claim that the breakdown of the unipolar world system is leading to the emergence of a new mode of production. How could this be possible? Does anyone, them included, actually know what they're talking about? Do they mean to say that the USA's opponents are ushering in communist production? Because there can be no new mode of production until the world is communist. Whatever your positions on the state of socialist nations today, we've already seen the building of some socialist systems, which are in reality transitional modes of production, we hope, towards communism, and not really their own separate mode of production. Then the communist mode of production is something that we know cannot be truly achieved unless it's international, so certainly that is not emerging on an immediate scale. Although an argument can be made, I guess, that it is emerging in the sense that human historical development does inevitably push us towards communism, but it's doubtful that that's what they're arguing. Do they mean then that there is some alternate mode of production emerging different from or separate to the capitalist and communist one? Because that's certainly not true. It even more certainly runs counter to all logic and honest applications of Marxism to the present conditions. Something that's vital to understand for any principled communist is that the discovery of quote-unquote new forms of capitalism is a distortion. Now, as gestured to beforehand, it is the duty of communists to keep revolutionary proletarian politics and theory updated, and of course, capitalism could never be exactly the same as it was even just a decade ago. Marxist dialectical and historical materialism capture a massive conglomeration of processes and relations as they are in motion, and that means they succeed in understanding these fluid and often massive, seemingly intangible systems of human production and organization. But they also seek to, and we as Marxists think that they successfully manage to, establish the laws by which they operate. All of this is to say, while things like neoliberalism and advancements in technology certainly represent developments in capitalism which must be understood and described, just as imperialism was in Lenin's time, they are still capitalism, and as such operate on the very same laws. That is, the fundamental, unchanging truth of the capitalist system has not and will not change until it is abolished, that capital's drive is to endlessly expand itself, and that the capitalist relation and mode of production remains, exploiting labor for surplus value. These are its immutable characteristics, and as such, our goal remains the same. To suggest that there's some new kind of capitalism that differs is to throw yourself in the same camp as the most shameless bourgeois pundits that seek to water down working class politics by grafting them to capitalism. And this is precisely the kind of behavior these patriotic socialists are more than happy to unthinkingly engage in. Let's continue with the ACP's party program. Again, once we dig beyond what was lifted from CPUSA, we find the realm of pure eclectica. Point 11 is titled, Accelerate the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The Communist Party stands for the establishment of a state, municipal, and cooperative enterprise system. What the fuck does that? What is that? That operates according to socially governed principles of the modern information economy rather than profit. The Communist Party stands for the large-scale implementation of cybernetic technologies across the whole economy and the implementation of AI-driven national economic planning, with the express aims of advancing national development, reducing the work week and laboring years, and improving objective indexes of general quality of life and happiness. I mean, this is just pure aesthetics branded as politics, and really just crazy, like, we're gonna preserve capitalism shit here. Like, yeah, we want to maintain an enterprise system, I guess, that rather than, substituting, I guess, communist production for capitalist production, we just want to, like, operate according to socially governed principles of the modern information economy, a fucking capitalist economy, rather than profit somehow. I mean, I'm just, like, I'm going off the deep end here, but, like, what are they talking about? Anyway, it really deserves no deeper analysis, as that would assume that the writers of this drivel gave any deeper thought to this point than, like, well, sounds nice to us, doesn't it? Communism is for the liberation of productive forces, which does not mean replicating the capitalist drive for endless growth. Many Marxists without a very deep understanding see the irrationality and anarchy of production and rightly intuit that a proletarian state would be able to harness development and production in a much more efficient way. But their mistake lies in the conclusion that this liberation is synonymous with economic development as growth. This is still a wholly capitalist understanding of production, concerned more with development for development's sake, like the capitalist, and not development towards communist society. Yes, the process of building towards communism obviously requires a transition from capitalism, and we are not so politically immature as to decry the existence of capitalist relations under a proletarian dictatorship. As long as the proletariat is at the helm, pushing the world on the path towards communism, we can tolerate any existence of the capitalist relation, but we beg you to identify it as such. It's okay to recognize that some capitalist dynamics will inevitably still exist, possibly even until the realization of communism, but this is simply confusing capitalist production and development for the achievement of our goals. We'll finish up our tiring evaluation of the ACP's strain of American nationalism by explaining the important distinction between proletarian and national culture. What does that mean? Well, much of the patriotic distortion source can be explained both by a puddle-deep understanding of the processes of history, that cartoonish view we keep referencing, and an inability to distinguish between the dominant capitalist nationalist culture in history and revolutionary proletarian culture in history. This is a problem for all patriotic socialists, and it is precisely what leads to such jokes as Bill of Rights socialism, but it's most visible in the ACP, so we're talking about it here. In the section of their party program with the totally mask-off title of Promotion of American Civilization, the ACP explains that while they stand for the promotion of language, autonomy, economic development, and culture of American tribes, they see this as a means for the cultivation and discovery of a national continental American culture on the basis of the unique history, geography, and ethnic makeup of the American peoples, in the attempt to create a unified American historical, national, and cultural identity to overcome all racial and social antagonisms. So, while they accept that indigenous peoples exist, as well as other minorities, they should all subordinate themselves to an invented American continental culture. A video on their YouTube channel demonstrates more of the American nationalist fetish they go for, and should give us all an idea of what this unified American culture actually looks like to them. Over a cover of a Union song from the Civil War, next they'll be telling us how Lincoln was actually a communist, we see images of American labor and production interlaced with a delirium of AI-generated sci-fi bullshit, clearly lauding the ruthless hyper-development of American capitalism, which has destroyed so much of the environment and communities inhabiting this continent and others. The American culture they put forward is so clearly the culture of settler mythos, of the white worker, and not a well thought out and honest imagining of what a truly revolutionary proletarian culture could look like upon victory. Much of being able to put forth the proper party tactics rely directly on having a proper historical orientation, which informs a proper understanding of material reality, of material conditions, also necessary to make actually useful propositions for the future and for the building of communism. This is why these things like the Marxist understanding of history matter so much. If you cannot properly identify and understand the settler colonial nature of America, if you cannot distinguish between the myths you have been fed by the bourgeoisie and the actual proletarian reality, how can you ever lead the proletariat to victory? Let's set out some parameters again. The Fundamentals of Revolutionary Communism from 1957, published in Il Programma Comunista, gives us a good refutation of the ACP's childlike and anti-Marxist view of history as aesthetics and great individuals. Marxism states that the actions of individuals depend on forces developed by general, wider interests, and this is just as much when individuals react as single molecules of the mass acting in concert with others as, and above all, when they are brought together into groups at crucial junctures in the historic struggle by the general dynamics of society. Either we read history as Marxists, or we relapse into scholastic masturbations, which explain great events as due to monarchical maneuverings over hereditary claims and the transmission of the crown to heirs, or as the exploits of dashing buccaneers, urged on to perform great exploits in the quest for personal glory and posthumous immortality. For us, and for Marx, it is just not possible for the lone individual, taking conscious foresight as his starting point, to go out and mold society and history in conformity with his motive will. And this goes not only for the poor devil of a molecule floundering about in the social magma, but even more so for kings and the queens, for those invested with high office and honors, for those with dozens of titles and initials after their names. It is indeed particularly these people who don't know what they want, don't achieve what they thought they would, and to whom, if you'll excuse the noble expression, historical determinism reserves its biggest kick up the backside. In fact, if you accept our doctrine, leaders are more puppets of history than anyone else. So to finally get to the meat of this important distinction between proletarian and national culture, we'll be relying once again on Lenin in his 1914 article on the national pride of the Great Russians. I actually had a patriotic socialist tell me to read this, as if it were a damning refutation of my position, that the great socialist leader himself had supported the same thing as their ACP cretins. Yes, this document can in fact be used as a shining beacon of patriotic socialism, if you do not have eyes to see. Removing quotes from both their historical and theoretical context, even Lenin quickly becomes the very thing he fights against in this piece. Look, he comes right out and says it. Is a sense of national pride alien to us, great Russian class-conscious proletarians? Certainly not. We love our language and our country, and we are doing our very utmost to raise her toiling masses to the level of a democratic and socialist consciousness. We are full of a sense of national pride, and full of a sense of national pride, we great Russian workers want, come what may, a free and independent, a democratic, republican, and proud great Russia. If only that was all he wrote. Unfortunately for the patriotic socialist, he actually has much more to say than these simple cherry-picked quotes. It's also quite possible that the person who recommended this confused Lenin's use of the term Great Russian for some, nationalist patriotism. In reality, it's more of an anachronism. It's just a term that refers to the lands and people under the Russian Tsar, specifically Russians, as opposed to white Russians like Belarusians, etc. But I digress. Lenin writes that, "We are full of a sense of national pride, and for that very reason we particularly hate our slavish past, when the landed nobility led the peasants into war to stifle the freedom of Hungary, Poland, Persia, and China, and our slavish present, when these selfsame landed proprietors, aided by the capitalists, are loading us into a war in order to throttle Poland and the Ukraine, crush the democratic movement in Persia and China, and strengthen the gang of Romanovs, Babrinskys, and Purishkeviches, who are disgrace to our great Russian national dignity. Nobody is to be blamed for being born a slave, but a slave who not only eschews of striving for freedom but justifies and eulogizes his slavery, e.g. calls the throttling of Poland and the Ukraine, etc. a defense of the fatherland of the great Russians, such a slave is a lickspittle and a bore who arouses a legitimate feeling of indignation, contempt, and loathing. To us, it is most painful to see and feel the outrages, the oppression, and the humiliation our fair country suffers at the hands of the Tsar's butchers, the nobles, and the capitalists. We take pride in the resistance to these outrages put up from our midst, from the great Russians. In that midst having produced Radishev, the Decembrists, and the revolutionary commoners of the 70s, in the great Russian working class having created, in 1905, a mighty revolutionary party of the masses, and in the great Russian peasantry having begun to turn towards democracy and set about overthrowing the clergy and the landed proprietors. Great stuff. In reality, this article is a polemical device, representative of Lenin's clever way of utilizing bourgeois rhetoric by turning it on its head, not thoughtlessly repeating it. He's using the claims of the bourgeoisie that communists are against the nation and throwing them back at them, rather than accepting their charge and clamoring to prove to them that they are really, in fact, on the same side as the bourgeoisie claim to be, as our friends at the ACP and CPUSA do. He deftly calls into question the real meaning of being true to one's people and serving their interests, and stopping short of just coming out and saying it, explains that the interests of the proletariat cannot find their solution within the class collaborationists' national interest, but rather only from within themselves. By toying with the ideas of national pride and culture, Lenin picks them apart and puts forth the correct formulation, demonstrating that the real national and cultural pride the proletariat finds is precisely and decisively in not just their survival in spite of oppression by the national elite, but more concretely in their resistance to it. It is impossible, in the 20th century and in Europe, even in the Far East of Europe, to defend the fatherland otherwise than by using every revolutionary means to combat the monarchy, the landowners, and the capitalists of one's own fatherland, i.e., the worst enemies of our country. We say that the great Russians cannot defend the fatherland otherwise than by desiring the defeat of Tsarism in any war, this as the lesser evil to 9/10 of the inhabitants of Great Russia. For Tsarism not only oppresses those 9/10 economically and politically, but also demoralizes, degrades, dishonors, and prostitutes them by teaching them to oppress other nations and to cover up this shame with hypocritical and quasi-patriotic phrases. So, to the patriotic socialists who throw a tantrum when we say that we must be open in the fact that our fight is against America and all that it stands for, here is Lenin saying that the single most patriotic thing that you can do for your country is to seek its destruction and the victory of proletarian revolution. He goes on, the interests of the great Russians' national pride, understood not in the slavish sense, coincide with the socialist interests of the great Russian and all other proletarians. Our model will always be Marx, who, after living in Britain for decades and becoming half English, demanded freedom and national independence for Ireland in the interests of the socialist movement of the British workers. We all know that communism is and must be internationalist. To understand national pride in the slavish sense is to be a reactionary, a patriot, counterposed to the socialist interests of the national proletariat, whose interests coincide with the international proletariat. They're one and the same. Let's put this into the American context, and into some more tangible terms. We are so insistent on understanding the settler-colonial relation and rejecting the callous usage of mythologized references to the greatness of American patriotic ventures like the Revolution, Civil War, and the New Deal, not out of a rabid dogmatism, but out of practical consideration for the tasks at hand. In regards to this, we can look to what Lenin writes about the German unifier Otto von Bismarck. In his own Junker fashion, Bismarck accomplished a progressive historical task, but he would be a fine Marxist indeed who, on such grounds, thought of justifying socialist support for Bismarck. Moreover, Bismarck promoted economic development by bringing together the disunited Germans, who were being oppressed by other nations. The economic prosperity and rapid development of Great Russia, however, required that the country be liberated from Great Russian oppression of other nations. That is the difference that our admirers of the true Russian would-be Bismarcks overlook. The settler-colonial national culture does not represent the culture or interests of the American proletariat, not even the white ones. Why should we blindly wave to the Bismarcks, or in our case, the Lincolns or the Roosevelts, because they accomplished somewhat of a progressive historical task? We are in a similar situation to what Lenin writes about Russia. The country must be liberated from American oppression of other nations, both at home and abroad. The real proletarian culture of this land is to be found in diametric opposition to all the things America represents. If all that America represents is settler colonial genocide, African slavery, ruthless imperialism, and unbridled capitalism, which, make no mistake, is certainly the truth, then all the good that can be found in this country is a direct result of proletarian culture, survival, and resistance. All of the good in this country is a direct result of diametric opposition to America, even when it's co-opted by the bourgeoisie and made it to seem as if it contributes to and serves the national culture. A good example is the music of America, like jazz, rock, and country, which all stemmed from proletarian resistance to the destructive oppression of America, and not from some mythologized idea of America as this exceptionally accepting nation. The bourgeoisie seeks to instill in us class collaborationism. They cultivate the notion that we cannot, at any cost, deviate from or step outside the framework of America. That would mean denying proletarian culture, too. But in reality, once you're able to understand and frame American national culture as opposed to or separate from proletarian culture, you can see that we are free to take pride in the actually good things that have happened on this land in a much more meaningful, motivating sense, because we can actually understand them as what they are: resistance to oppression and domination, which are all that the dominant culture truly represents. American left exceptionalism tells us that the myths our bourgeoisie tells us are actually true, that America does actually represent a unique, melting pot society where bourgeois culture gets swept up in a maelstrom with proletarian culture that there's no use in parsing out, that we can reconcile the values of the worst dominators of the world with the values of the proletariat, whose interests can only be their annihilation. Some patriotic socialists, and even well-meaning people, may wonder why a topic like this should even be covered, and rightfully question if this is an efficient use of energy, or if analyzing this current even means anything. Hopefully, through understanding that some of these ideological tendencies present in a majority of leftists in America are flaws, one can understand that they are a thing to be fought against. Resignation of the idea of America to the dustbin must be a prerequisite of revolutionary activity here, from the revolutionary movement to the conscious working class, because allegiance to its ideals restrains revolutionary action, and the burden of proper action weighs on us, urging us to commit to logical, reasonable critique of the material conditions in this country, leading to the only possible conclusions, which are that this nation cannot exist. Certainly not after successful revolution. We aren't even discussing the construction of future communist culture and society, which will never leave any room for bourgeois nations. On a broader level too, if we are genuinely committed to our principles, it is incumbent on us to attempt to maintain our course on the proper line, ideally to preserve the independent class position of the proletariat, which is crystallized in the proper application of communist politics. This means, in simpler terms, that we must fight against the corruption and co-optation of revolutionary ideology of the communist program. From the classic story of the Second International's capitulation to nationalism in the face of World War I, to the many betrayals of social democracy in the face of rising fascism, and further imitations and distortions of the principles of Marxism and practical revolution, many forces, conscious or not, well-intentioned or malicious, have sought to change, mutate, and bend the revolutionary ideology to their will. We say this will never work not because of any slavish, dogmatic obsession to an imaginary absolute truth, but because in reality, in actually applying communist politics to change the world for the better, there can only be an unabashed, calculated, methodical, responsible evaluation and application of the ideology. There's no room for vacillation, for covering things up with sugary masks. There's only the struggle, the concerted and genuine attempt at revolutionary change. In short, we don't need to lie to ourselves, or each other. We'll end by quoting at length on this from an article titled Activism, originally published on November 7, 1952 in Battaglia Comunista. The transformation of the bourgeois crisis into class war and revolution presupposes the objective collapse of the social and political framework of capitalism. But this is not even potentially possible if the great mass of the workers is not won over to or influenced by the revolutionary theory disseminated by the party, a theory that is not improvised on the barricades. But will this theory perhaps be distilled behind closed doors by scholarly labors without any connection to the masses? In response to this stupid accusation made by the fanatics of activism, one may quite correctly respond that the indefatigable and assiduous labor of defense waged on behalf of the doctrinal and critical patrimony of the movement, the everyday tasks of the immunization of the movement against the poisons of revisionism, the systematic explanation, in the light of Marxism, of the most recent forms of organization of capitalist production, the unmasking of the attempts on the part of opportunism to present such innovations as anti-capitalist measures, etc., all of this is struggle. The struggle against the class enemy, the struggle to educate the revolutionary vanguard. It is, if you prefer, an active struggle that is nonetheless not activism. Do you seriously believe that the arduous and exhausting task of restoring the revolutionary Marxist critique is merely a theoretical undertaking? Who would dare to deny that it is also a political labor, an active struggle against the class enemy? Only he who is possessed by the demons of activist action could think such a thing. The movement, even if it is weak in terms of numbers of adherents, that works on its newspapers, on its meetings, on holding factory discussions, to free revolutionary theory from unprecedented adulterations, from opportunist contaminations, thus performs a revolutionary labor, a labor for the proletarian revolution.